I am Adam Woods. I'm from the Australian Museum. I'm part of the first national frog count. It's a pretty exciting project because it's citizen science and science coming together quite closely and working together to try and get really positive outcomes for the environment. But before I get into that, just a couple of little guessing games. Has anyone ever heard that one before? Yep. It is a tree frog. It is the eastern dwarf tree frog. So a common frog around Sydney, a common frog found in your lettuce. So yeah, you will see these a lot. You'll see these during the daylight hours. They do bask in the sun, unlike a lot of other native frogs in this area, which tend to only come out at night time. What about this one? You'll notice that all frogs do not sound the same. This is a bleating tree frog. So another native to the Sydney region, nowhere near as common as the frog we just saw a second ago. But again, you can hear that it is a very different call to the previous frog. So that's where FrogID starts. We're an app. We are based on audio calls of frogs, so we want everybody who has an iPhone or an Android phone to download the FrogID app. Basically, the app allows you to record any frogs you hear near you and submit them to the Australian Museum. So we're on a bit of a quest in order to, I guess, map Australia's frogs. There's a lot of areas around Australia that we don't know much about frogs, and this app allows us to learn more by tapping into the millions of Australians who have phones. So launched nationally in November 2017. It's free, you don't have to pay for it, and it has quite an extensive field guide in it too. So if you're not keen on recording, you can learn a lot about frogs just by having the app. Obviously you can record and submit calls, and everything you submit to us will be identified by an expert, and you will be told what frog it is. So if we can't work out what frog it is, you're in a pretty good zone, because it might be something interesting that we haven't heard before, that we need to do further investigation, but most submissions we can tell you what kind of frog you've got. I guess the question is why? Why are we doing this? 42% of all amphibians on the planet at the moment are at risk of extinction. It's a huge problem and something that we need to address, and it's not something that we talk about a lot here in Australia. We talk a lot about cute and cuddlies, and all the scientists always complain about koalas getting the spotlight, but there are a lot of other animals that are that need support as well. So some of the reasons that there's risk of extinction is habitat loss and degradation, so land clearing, disease. So we know there's a lot of research out at the moment about the chytrid fungus and the big impact that's having on frogs. Introduced species such as the mosquito fish are also playing a role, but then there's the big ones that are a little bit harder to pinpoint exactly, like climate change, pollution, and a wildlife trade. Here in Australia, we have 240 native species of frog, which you'll notice if you download the app and check out the list. But that's continuing to grow. So interestingly, we don't know all of Australia's frogs yet. In 2016, this beautiful frog was only identified and catalogued. So it's pretty interesting that a frog that looks so pretty and so enigmatic hadn't yet been described. So we're working hard at the Australian Museum to try and describe more of Australia's species. There's 4 frogs that are definitely extinct, and there's 29 species that are threatened with extinction here in Australia. These frogs look really similar, so we're going back to the app now. These frogs are, from looking at them, it's very difficult to tell the difference, but the call is a little bit of an indicator for us. So that's the frog on the left. The frog on the right looks very similar. It's a green frog, it's got a white stripe down its side. It's got fingers and toes, it probably climbs trees. But it makes a very different noise. So that's why we like using FrogID and audio to identify species. If you send me a picture of a frog and I get a grainy picture that is a green frog in its habitat, it's going to be really hard for us to tell the difference between species. But when you hear the calls like that, it's much more simple, and we can make more positive identifications and map the frogs more accurately. So what do we know so far? We've got a big map of Australia with lots of records around it. We're doing really well, FrogID. We've got over 60,000. It says there 56,000, but that's an old slide. It's now over 60,000, and we've got over 85,000 verified frog records, which is an amazing effort. And we've actually mapped 186 of Australia's species. So we're getting there. We're starting to learn a whole lot about Australia's frogs. But interestingly, our map of frogs is very similar to a population map of Australia. So the idea for us is to try and get FrogID out into communities and fill those gaps in knowledge. And just another interesting call for you. It's going to be harder to hear. Can you hear all that? That's a submission from Samantha from Queensland. That actually has 11 species of frog calling in one call. So one record, one submission from one person has actually ended up in 11 species being put on the map, which is a large amount of information from one record. Rightio. Does anyone know what this is even before I play it? Do we know what it is now? Come on. It's Sydney. It's a Perrin's tree frog. These are the kind of guys that have done really well in urbanisation. They're not at risk of extinction. You'll find them in your backyard. Someone came up to me today and said they found one. They live 5 stories up a building. They found one in a pot plant on their balcony. So they're not at risk of extinction, but they're an iconic frog in this region, Litoria peronii. So what's happening in Sydney? We've still got a lot of records in Sydney, and you can see there are some areas on the map there that we'd love to fill, particularly in the southwest. There's a lot going on out there in terms of development, so we would like to know more about what frogs exist out there before we jump in and make too many big changes. But I guess for us, there's the case of winners and losers. The Perrin's tree frog, really common in Sydney. So you're going to find them everywhere. There's some other winners as well. The common eastern froglet. Has anyone come across the common eastern froglet before? Yep. They're common by name, common by nature. We've got lots of records. They're the most recorded species in Sydney at the moment. And you can see they're quite widespread. They're right across the Sydney Basin. They look like that. You're much more likely to hear them than you are see them. They're tiny, only a bit over 2 centimetres, brown, and they live on the ground in the mud. So good luck looking for them, but you'll hear them all the time. Striped marsh frogs, very similar. Really well distributed across Sydney, where our data is collected. Live just about anywhere. You'll find them in just about any pond or creek across Sydney, and they look like that. Much bigger than the common eastern froglet. These guys will get up to about 8 centimetres. But again, they live on the ground, they're in amongst the leaf litter, and they make a bit of a talking noise, a bit like a tennis ball being hit by a good impersonation in the audience there. And then the Perrin's tree frog is number 3 on our list. Again, very well distributed around Sydney and looks a little bit like that. But a good example of why using a frog's looks alone to identify it is not the greatest thing to do. This is a Perrin's tree frog. What most people have encountered is a very light grey looking frog in their yard. These guys are a little bit more colourful than that, but exactly the same species. Next, the graceful tree frog. Not something that you would consider from the Sydney region. They're actually much further north, but we're putting them in the winners list because they're starting to appear in the Sydney region. This is a good example of a frog presenting itself outside of its home range. It obviously is something that we want to learn more about as to why that frog is starting to persist on the Central Coast. But really interesting to get that information, and something that we can keep an eye on as we start to collect more data. Who are the losers in Sydney though? Has anyone got any ideas of an example of a frog that might be losing in Sydney? Boom, first, number one. We've got 2 records of the green and golden bell frog. We do know they persist in populations in Homebush and on the Central Coast, but obviously we don't encourage people to go and record those. But they look a little something like that, much like the Latoria phallax. You might see these actually basking during the day, like that photo suggests. It's nice and sunlit. Yeah, but something, the kind of species that was really brought to our attention when the Olympic project was happening. Red pound toadlet, something local to the area. You guys may have heard of it before. This frog is under serious threat, obviously due to the amount of urbanisation in the Sydney region. This map kind of shows that it's persisting right on the edge. Sandstone country, it's in some pretty big trouble, but if you've seen that little guy, you've seen one of the threatened species in the Sydney Basin. And the green tree frog, which is an interesting one. We've got some green tree frogs here today, and a lot of people are surprised to find out that Sydney is actually a home to the green tree frog. But there is a population northwest of Sydney, and there is population south of Sydney as well. But these were much more widely spread in the past. So it's interesting to see the data is actually starting to suggest that the population is on the decline in Sydney, and that's obviously a bit of a concern. So we would like to know more about that, and it's something that we will investigate. And you've obviously seen pictures, or come and see us at the tent if you want to learn more about that. So for Greater Sydney, about 38 species, 3 superabundant species. 76% of all our records are the common eastern froglet, the striped marsh frog, or the Perrin's tree frog. We've recorded 8 threatened species, and there's obviously the decline of other species happening as well. The big concern going forward, I guess, is the introduced species, the potential for the cane toad to come down here, and also native species starting to change their range. So we do need to learn a lot more about that, and the more records we get, the more we know about those populations moving. There's our enigmatic frog. So what's next? What can you do? What can we do sitting at home to help conserve frogs? Download the app. It's as simple as that. If you've got the app in your pocket, every time you hear a frog, you can record it. It's as simple as that little recording screen there has a little red spot on it. You press it for 30 seconds, the little line spins around, and then you hit the button that says submit. And then the Australian Museum has a record of a frog that we then put in all the atlases. This is a fantastic opportunity for people to get involved in science, but also it's really, really valuable to our research team at the museum to have more and more and more data. So get involved, download the app. That's pretty obvious. But what else can you do? I guess if you live in the right area, you can look at building yourself a frog habitat. We always look at this with a little bit of caution. We don't want everyone to just stick a pond in their yard and we end up with a lot of the same habitat. Consider what species might live close to you. If you live on the fringe of a bushland area that has different species of frog, then by all means do some research on that and find out what habitat is going to best suit that species. Don't just cookie cutter a pond from Bunnings in the ground. Try and understand how the variations in habitat are really important to different frog species. And then of course monitor that. If you put it in your backyard, monitor it. Send us recordings of those frog species, and we'll help you learn more about what frogs live in your area. And then just for fun, this really cool call, I just couldn't leave it out because it's really awesome. That's pretty irrelevant, but it's cool. That's the northern spadefoot from northern Australia. And just quickly, thanks to all of the partners that are involved in our project. We have some really great partnerships, and Bunnings is one of those, working with schools, putting frog ponds in schools. So if you have a child out of school and you think a frog pond would be great in their school, then get in touch with your local Bunnings and they'll make it happen. And obviously the government different museums that support us as well. Thank you very much.